Welcome to everyone to the second installment of our social media profit and protection series. We started this series in the fall when the data analyst Frances Hagen from Facebook made the testimony before Congress about how Facebook knew about its internal research showing harm to young people with social media and their platforms, and they did nothing to stop it or mitigate it in any way. And so we thought it was important for the humanities to have a say in how technology is used in society. And that's the main purpose of a series like this, is that I have no problem with technology doing what it does. I obviously have an Apple Watch and so on and so forth. The thing that concerns me is when companies are able to act without any accountability regarding the use of technology and regarding our dependency on it. And so one of the things I think that was one of the most important topics I wanted to cover in this series was the issue of free speech. Free speech in the current age couldn't be more critical, both with consideration of the war in Ukraine and how Russia is controlling state media. Russia just shut down the last independent news organization in Russia. It was called TV Rain. It was on YouTube primarily. The main anchors and editors fled Russia. They're now, I think, in Georgia in order to escape possible repercussions from Putin's government. So the topic of free speech is also reflected in our society in terms of what we want and expect as citizens. So in order to address this very important topic, I am so pleased that we have Professor Holly Hamilton-Bleakley, who is Assistant Adjunct Professor of Philosophy here at the University of San Diego. She earned a BA from Wellesley College in Economics, and a Master of Philosophy and a PhD in Intellectual History and Political Thought from the University of Cambridge. Her main area of expertise is late medieval and early modern moral and political philosophy. She has published several articles on late medieval notions of virtue ethics, natural law theory, and moral reasoning. Her research also looks at ways in which the liberal themes of individualism and freedom were understood during this era. At USD, she teaches a wide variety of subjects, including theoretical and applied ethics, philosophy of religion, ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, philosophy of law, and philosophy of human nature. As a graduate student, she was trained in the Cambridge contextual approach to philosophy, pioneered by the philosopher Quentin Skinner, which utilizes the speech act theory developed by the philosopher J.L. Austin. Soon after completing her PhD, Professor Hamilton-Bleakley organized a conference to reassess Skinner's contribution to the study of the history of philosophy. The proceedings of the conference were published by Cambridge University Press in a volume entitled Rethinking the Foundations of Modern Political Thought, and Professor Hamilton-Bleakley was invited to contribute a piece explaining the philosophical underpinnings of Skinner's approach, entitled Linguistic Philosophy and the Foundations. In 2010, the book was reprinted in Chinese. The Chinese government obviously needs to learn a few things. Since 2016, she has returned somewhat to her earlier interest in philosophical issues related to speech, but this time with an emphasis on virtue ethics, as well as her enduring interest in questions regarding freedom. In thinking about free speech, she has developed Aristotelian-inspired counter concepts of good speech and evil speech, as well as arguments regarding how these concepts might inform the larger debate over free speech. In spring 2022, she is teaching Philosophy 334, The Ethics of Free Speech, a new course which she conceived and designed. So please welcome Professor Holly Hamilton-Bleakley.
I think you might need this. Okay. Is this okay? Yes, it's echoing. Okay. Okay, I'm actually not used to sitting down, I'm realizing, and talking, so I might have to stand up. Okay. I don't want to touch that because that's tight. That's technology, right? Okay, actually I don't have hands and we'll see how this goes. Sorry. Okay, so free speech and social media. The first thing I want to say is I wish I had an answer. But in that admission, I think there lies the point that this is a complex topic and we need to be discussing just how we're going to proceed, just what free speech is going to look like in the future. I've never been a futurist. I've always been more interested in the past. But for the first time, I find myself thinking, okay, what is this going to, what is this going to look like in the future? So, and I've done a lot of, read a lot of academic papers, watched a lot of conferences on free speech in the kind of current climate. And indeed, there are very few settled opinions as to how to go about setting parameters for speech in this brave new world of constant speech and instant speech. That's kind of how I describe social media speech, constant and instant, different than what we used to have. This is also why I wanted to teach a whole course on the ethics of free speech, because free speech is not the sort of thing that you can just say, we should have free speech. Of course, we should have free speech. And it's also not the sort of thing that you can say, free speech is dead. We need to kick all the haters off of social media. Everyone knows this. You can't have either of those positions, I don't think. So there are some real problems on the table here. There are real harms that are possible. And there are also real goods that we are losing. So also it might be helpful to lay out some of my own commitments here. I actually never do this. I never lay out my own commitments. When I'm doing papers, that's the British training that I received. But yeah, I mean, I am committed to something like free speech. I think that's important to just lay out. I find myself resisting on the intuitive level arguments which advocate heavy censorship. It's not that I am going to say that censorship is never warranted. Of course, I wouldn't hold that. I'm not making that claim. But I do think that it's proving difficult to come up with a principled approach as to when censorship is warranted. So I've just said that we need to think about what free speech will look like in the future, because most of our speech is on some kind of social media now, it seems like. But in order to do that, it's helpful too to remind ourselves of what free speech is and what it has been. That is, just how have we justified free speech in the past? What are the reasons that we give as to why we think it's valuable? So the main philosopher that's brought up in this context is John Stuart Mill, the British philosopher who writes On Liberty in 1859. In this piece, Mill puts forward a very strong argument in favor of free speech. We've actually just been studying this we've been studying Mill in our free speech class. The students are writing an essay on his argument this week. Mill makes a very liberal argument that the individual is sovereign, and as such, they have a kind of realm of non-interference around them, which Mill terms an absolute right. He claims that in this realm of individual sovereignty, we have liberty of conscience in the most comprehensive sense, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical and speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. That's his quote. So according to Mill, as an individual, I should have this absolute liberty regarding my thoughts and opinions. Now, the other side of the argument is that the only time my liberty can be limited is when I pose a danger or harm to others. And so this will end up being the famous harm principle, which states that the actions of individuals should only be limited to prevent harm to other individuals. Now, if we go back to Mill's claim that we should have absolute liberty regarding our thoughts and opinions, his rationale here is that your thoughts comprise what he calls an inward domain of consciousness. This inward domain of consciousness should be protected by this realm of non-interference. So the basic idea here seems to be I should be able to think what I want. I'm sovereign over my own mind and my own body, and I'm not accountable to anyone else, including society at large, for these things. I'm only accountable to society for that part of my conduct which concerns others, according to Mill. Okay, so we already have some fairly large claims. And we can talk more about that when we open it up for discussion, whether these claims can hold. But what happens next in the argument is that Mill then connects this individual sovereignty to speech. So he argues that there's such a tight connection between thought and speech that to limit the one would be to limit the other. Or to be more precise, we could say that to interfere with one would be to interfere with the other. And so since he has argued that it's wrong to interfere or coerce someone regarding their inner thoughts, then it's also wrong to interfere or coerce someone regarding their speech. Now, I do think that Mill makes an important point here regarding the connection between thought and speech. And when I teach this piece, I make sure that I take some time to really discuss this with students. I think it's undeniable that speaking is a form of thinking, and that so often speaking clarifies your thoughts. There are so many occasions where students will raise their hand and make a comment in a lecture and then say something like, "This sounded way better in my head," right? And I will say, "Yes, I know." Me too. So part of being a clear thinker is being able to put your thoughts into words. And this is part of why we want to create an environment in which we can speak freely so that we can be better thinkers. But to just go back to Mill's main argument, once he's established that thought and speech are inextricably intertwined and therefore puts speech in the space of absolute right, he then goes on to make a further claim that the harm principle does not apply to speech. In other words, he does not think that you can limit speech because of the outward harm it might create. So even though speech is clearly an outward relational act, he decides to stress more its connection to the inner state of a person and therefore keep it protected in that sense. So Mill claims that the only way that the harm principle can be applied to speech is by recognizing the harm that comes about when we restrict speech. And here's where we get to some of the most enduring of Mill's arguments, which is that we cause real harm when we restrict or censor speech. And what harm could that be? Mill argues that it is the harm of losing the opportunity of exchanging truth for error. Mill then goes on to describe the ways in which an exposure to lots of different voices and opinions on a subject will enable an individual to hear all sides of an argument and become better in their thinking and reasoning for listening to all these sides. And although Tim is my husband's name. Okay, no. Although Mill never uses the term marketplace of ideas, there is something like that at work here, as he seems to assume that the best ideas will endure and wrong ideas will fall out of favor by putting them in the public sphere of debate. Mill even goes on to assert that the only way an individual can be a truly wise person and a person of good judgment is if they have taken the time to seriously consider every side of an issue and learned how to articulate what is weak about a particular position and what is strong about a particular position. And through all this, the wise person must be the kind of person who can admit when they are wrong and learn how to change their position when confronted with better ideas. Okay, so those are some of the highlights of Mill's argument for free speech. As I said earlier, during the discussion afterwards, we can give some specific critiques of this argument, but one thing that needs to be said is how influential this account has been in the history of philosophy, particularly as arguments for free speech developed in the 20th century and particularly the late 20th century. Various philosophical arguments have been developed connecting free speech to something like individual autonomy and individual dignity. Mill doesn't really use those terms, but this Millian idea that the individual develops into a better kind of person if they're allowed to think freely and speak freely and hear others speak freely is definitely connected to these later arguments that free speech is necessary for individual autonomy, for the development of one's identity, and so forth. We then start to see the idea that free speech is connected to equality. Indeed, it is a sign of equality that individuals all have this right to free speech. And then once you have equality on the table, you can bring in the idea of individual dignity, because if individuals all have dignity, then that places them on a kind of equal moral ground. If you look at the work of someone like Ronald Dworkin, a philosopher of law. His arguments for free speech have included the idea that indeed we all have an equal dignity and therefore we should have the right to speak freely. Furthermore, he argues that, quote, we retain our dignity as individuals only by insisting that no one, no official, and no majority has the right to withhold opinion from us on the ground that we are not fit to hear and consider it. So just let me restate this. Dworkin argues that we retain our dignity when we are allowed to hear all opinions. In other words, we lose our dignity when an official power or a majority censors an opinion because we are not considered fit to hear that opinion. And this kind of concern about equality and dignity feeds into another justification for free speech, which is that free speech is essential for a democracy. Dworkin has written about this too, arguing that a majority decision is not fair unless everyone has had a fair opportunity to express his or her attitudes or opinions or fears or tastes or presuppositions or prejudices or ideals. Okay, long list. Dworkin argues that part of the democratic process is not only being able to influence others with your speech, but it's also having a right to state your opinion as an autonomous, responsible agent. So these are different arguments than Mill's, but they point strongly toward the idea of autonomy, dignity, moral responsibility, that I have rights that must be recognized as a rational moral agent and so forth. But I do think that these arguments take their cue from Mill. Furthermore, the kind of basic structure of Mill's argument was enormously influential in different US Supreme Court cases regarding speech, again, particularly in the 20th century, to the point where the court developed its stance that free speech would be protected unless it could be shown that the speech caused imminent direct harm. So what's interesting is that eventually the court came to make a distinction between direct imminent harm on the one hand and the bad tendency test on the other. So that even if there is a speech which gives people, quote, bad tendencies, as long as those bad tendencies don't lead to direct imminent harm, then that speech is protected. There are other ways that free speech has been defended, particularly in its relationship to democracy. It has been argued that free speech enables broad debate, which informs and improves the making of public policy. It's been argued that free speech prevents government from entrenching itself indefinitely. It's been argued that free speech prevents government abuse of power. And it has been argued that free speech promotes political stability by providing a safety valve for dissent. Okay, that's a little bit of where we have been when it comes to free speech. Now the question becomes, where are we now when it comes to free speech? And I think it's fair to say that social media, the way it works, the dynamics that it causes, gives us some reasons to revisit some of these claims about the value of free speech. It's not so much that free speech isn't valuable, because I think it is. I've already laid out my commitment that way. What I mean to say is that social media seems to have brought to the forefront what can be harmful about speech. I'm actually not completely happy using the term harm here. So perhaps I could restate this and say that social media has brought to the forefront just how dysfunctional speech can be. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm just a philosopher, but I am a human being. And just from a personal standpoint, I can state unequivocally that my life has been made worse, all things considered, because of social media. And this is why I started working on free speech issues back in 2016. I could not quite put my finger on what was wrong, but I knew something was wrong. What I think we can see is that with social media, we're not always seeing the million promise fulfilled of, quote, let everyone voice their opinion and let everyone hear all opinions and watch wise people develop and truth rise to the surface. If anything, the current state of affairs seems to be watch everyone voice their opinion, watch once good people develop into vicious people, and watch accusations and blatant lies rise to the surface. There are many reasons why the free speech promises don't seem to be fulfilled in the social media context. And this is where it gets a little more philosophical. One of those reasons must be the kind of speech which proliferates on social media. When a good friend of mine sent me a Facebook invitation way back in like 2010 or something, I stared at that empty chat box and I literally had no idea what to write. This is because I knew it could potentially be circulated to thousands of people, and I could see a million ways in which that was not going to end well. But it turns out that for many people, that empty chat box is an invitation, not to elevated, rigorous discourse, but to low-level insults, rumors, and provocative digs at whoever happens to be in their line of sight. Instead of going online and hearing speech that celebrates human connection and enables individual dignity to blossom before your eyes, the speech is more like what you would hear at a party where everyone else is drunk, except for you. And people start coming up to you and telling you how much they hate your religion or how much they want to sleep with your husband, whose name is Tim. Okay. This might be just a casual observation, but there's something that matters here. It is that social media is generally a hostile environment. It's a hostile environment because of the kind of speech that's used on social media, and it's therefore a hostile environment for speech to take place. So what this means is that the speech conditions on social media are such that our speech seems to be bound to do less of what we want it to do and more of what we don't want it to do. In order for me to explain this claim, I need to get a little bit technical with an explanation of the difference between locutionary acts and illocutionary acts that we make with our speech. This is something that I've sort of worked on a couple of years ago when I first started working out a kind of virtue theory of speech. The basic point is this: a locutionary act is the act of making a statement itself. An illocutionary act is what one is doing in making that statement. The way that I explain this difference is by saying that when we make an utterance, it's not just to make the utterance itself. It's not just to make sounds. There's a purpose, a state of affairs, which we're trying to achieve above and beyond the speech itself. So when a hearer understands what the speaker is trying to do and make the utterance, that is when the hearer grasps the illocutionary act of the speaker, then there's what we call uptake on the part of the hearer. So this does not mean that the hearer necessarily agrees with the speaker, but what it does mean is that there's been some kind of active communication between speaker and hearer. There's been some kind of reciprocity. So to turn to my claim that on social media, our speech seems to be bound to do less of what we want it to do and more of what we don't want it to do. What I mean to say here is that social media creates what I call unhappy speech conditions, such that the illocutionary force of our speech cannot be felt. So the claim here goes something like this. Part of free speech is being able to make these illocutionary speech acts, that is, to be recognized to be doing what you are doing in making the statement. If free speech is just the ability to make noises which can be recognized as speech, that speech could very well not communicate anything to anyone if no one wants to, how can I say this? Listen, at least give a fair sort of hearing to that person. Okay. So one aspect of the unhappy speech conditions is that speech misfires when it's not been recognized as doing what the speaker is trying to do with their speech. Okay. So here's what we get to the heart of the matter. Certain kind of speech can make other kinds of speech misfire. So another example might be helpful here. So for instance, one feminist well, maybe not actually, but one feminist argument regarding pornography, for instance, is that pornography sets a cultural expectation that women are sexually available upon demand. The argument is that when women then refuse unwanted sexual attention with the word no, their words are often not recognized as a refusal, and then they're subjected to unwanted sexual advances. So in this way, the argument is that pornographic speech has subordinated the speech of women and made women's utterance of no misfire. It's not taken as it's meant. Okay, that's just an analogy. Returning to social media, it seems to me that social media too creates unhappy speech conditions such that The speech on social media seems to misfire much of the time. Those speech conditions are created by hyperbolic speech, right? I think social media is full of hyperbolic speech, so that even non-hyperbolic statements are interpreted as making strong claims and also as staking a claim in a particular group or being on a particular side. So perhaps the Illocutionary Act of the speech was intended to be something quite respectable, like giving information, for instance, that the speaker thought was good information. But often people are not recognized as doing what they mean to be doing in speaking. And so they're mischaracterized as doing something that they're not necessarily doing in speaking. But once their speech is seen in a particular light, that is to be supporting a particular side of a particular issue, then the illocutionary force of the speech has no effect on anyone who is on the other side of the issue, right? So it's a very polarizing, it's a speech environment that's very polarizing. Whenever you speak into it, it just puts you on one side of the pole or the other, and therefore your speech is not taken seriously. It's not contributing to any kind of deliberative democracy. It's just increasing a polarization or a siloing. So even if you have good intentions with your speech, the illocutionary force is not felt. It's just siloed into a particular side. Okay. So the idea here is that even though social media is an effective way of getting out as many locutionary statements as you would wish, it doesn't seem to me to be an effective way of promoting many of the values we associate with free speech, such as promoting communication, respecting dignity, increasing deliberation when it comes to democracy. It doesn't seem to be doing any of those things. This is my view. Okay. However, even though I have no love for social media, and I think it is a breeding ground for dysfunctional, evil speech, I am also very concerned about the censorship on social media. So given all the ways in which I do not think that social media lives up to the benefits of the promises of the benefits of free speech, I still do not think that we have come up with a viable, workable principle as to when speech should be taken down and when it should not. So for all of the sort of criticisms I've made, I still think that there's something to Mill's idea of the individual as sovereign over their thoughts and opinions. And since social media continues to dominate the thoughts and opinions of most people, we need a theory as to how to democratically manage this huge digital space. And this is where I'm happy to start the conversation with everybody else. So philosophers lay out the problems, right?
No,
So yeah.
That's absolutely terrific. It was terrific, clear and concise. I think that I think you hit the nail on the head, that trying to find a theory about what to do about, I think part of this is that we don't, as you said, we haven't defined harm.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're having a hard, yeah, that's always up in the air. Yeah.
And so, and this is probably something that I would love to hear some of what some of the students think as well.
Mm-hmm.
How do you define harm regarding speech? Because this is the stepping stone to a theory, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, I mean, one thing I would say too, just, it's also clear that like the way that these censorship things are going, it's clear that the First Amendment isn't really going to stop any of this censorship because the courts are ruling in favor of the private tech companies. Mm-hmm. So they're letting the tech companies do the censoring. Mm-hmm. And it's not right. So all this First Amendment reasoning that we have isn't really applying now. And so now we need to also think about, these massive, massive private spaces where what are the rules, right? And they can be set by this private entity, but it has such a public impact. It seems like there would need to be more, interaction. There need to be more input from the users, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, problem solvers. Okay.
So I definitely think that one thing that you cause some sort of imminent. That is, definitely where the line is drawn and where that is. It can be hard to say. The way I've been discussing in class the last week or two, that I've sort of been understanding like, okay, well, when it's about to cause, cause people to immediately hurt themselves. Of course, like we have got fire in a crowded theater or something. Cause people to hurt themselves. But I think that the whole idea with environmental harm, hate speech, that's something a little bit tricky that I sort of struggle with. How do we define where that where does that approach that principle? And so that, I think it's
With the hate speech, you mean?
right.
Because the harm is more, I mean, it would be more like distress or
Right.
something like that.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And it can vary from person to person what is harmful to person. So,
Mhm.
that's the thing that can
Okay. Yeah. But there's a question back here. If you wanna-
Oh, yeah. So, I'm sorry not to be a problem solver, but a problem maker.
Sure. Yeah, I know.
So I want to start with where you finished.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the story gets interesting because, like, why would be a problem that there is like private censorship?
Mhm.
These are private platforms, right? In the sense that, like, it seems that it's like a totally different problem than what Neil was trying to do.
Yeah.
Like trying to like argue for public space, and then you have all this theory, right? But then like these are like private space, more similar to like my house. So there I really want to have the power
Mhm.
completely if it's open, right? All right, whatever I want to so why would it be problematic that like platforms, Twitter or Facebook, have that problem as long as like everyone can have their own house, and then like people can maybe where they feel that their speech is more restricted. That doesn't seem to violate freedom of speech. I want to hear more about why do you think that like the private enforcement will violate freedom of speech.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about, well, I've talked to a lot of different people about this. So it's kind of like, what's the analogy? Like, is Facebook like, is it like a church where we don't have to have some, an atheist come tell us their views from our pulpit? Is it like a university where we don't have to invite somebody here to, I don't know, tell you it costs too much or something? You know what I mean? Like, what is it? Something that would undermine the thing that you're trying to do, right, as that institution or as that church or as that group. So is it like that? Or is it more like, I'm a noble lord who owns half of England, and this is what I do in my land, and my peasants have no rights and they do what I say. And right, it seems to me like it's more like the third one. So these massive social media companies where the people that are in charge can just direct. I mean, what are the principles? What is a Facebook community? That thing is so massive. How could there possibly be a community? Right. So, but like you say, I mean, maybe the answer is just more private spaces, right? And then we just have more podcasts and we have more, and we get off-brand Twitters, and we get off, right? And we have, I don't know, we have Rumble instead of YouTube. I mean, we do have, those things are happening. And maybe in 5 years, we'll just have lots of different smaller things that are just lots of different small public spaces. Is that, I don't know, does that kind of answer what you?
Yeah, I like that.
Well, but yeah, well, I mean, which one would you think it would be?
I think it's
Okay. None of them. Yeah, well,
You exit the equal,
uh-huh.
you have no-
Mhm.
you exit Facebook, and because there is who are not like any of us,
Yeah, sure, you can leave if it makes you miserable, yeah. But then you don't, I mean, yeah, what are the individual costs? I mean, that's another question, right? Yeah, you can live your life and not be connected, and that's totally fine, but then you also aren't. But then what happens is you see what happens in the real world when people are connected, and the ways in which they're influencing each other and the conversations they're having that you're not a part of at all. Right. So it seems like yeah, the cost is low in terms of it's easy to just delete your account, although it's actually not that easy. Right. I had to go like a WikiHow page to figure it out. But yeah, it's fine. It's easy to exit, but the cost is that you're losing, there's potential costs of losing influence, I suppose. Anyway, go ahead. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was kind of reflecting on what you were talking about, the principles of free speech and whether social media achieves those or not.
Yeah.
And I think that if it came down to having a bunch of small companies that had small public spaces virtually, that would also kind of go against the principles of free speech, because it seems if we follow the same pattern we're in, then it would be, oh, this company advocates for this kind of speech, this company advocates for this kind of speech, and that's not really.
Then there's no public space.
There's no public space. It's
Yeah.
just kind of it's the same idea being talked about, and it's not an exchange of ideas. It's not going to lead towards more truth. It's not going to, promote dignity, because yeah, it just seems like that's not a good solution in my mind. But
Yeah. I mean, that's why I wanted to start with the benefits. Like, what are the goals of free speech? Why do we like it? What is my generation? I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Those of us who grew up with it, like, yeah, this is what we like about it. But it doesn't seem like what's the promise in this new world of it, that if it's a lot of different, just carved up private spaces. But that's probably what's going to end up being. I can't see a different solution. Right? Okay, go ahead.
So we've definitely been talking about like the future of free speech. One thing that I've heard people say before is that text gets censorship. Like, first geared toward the government suppress free speech, but as we sort of start moving into the future, and we've seen, for better or worse, beyond now, the world more of a spoken print to increasingly more of a digital world. I think that as these outlets like Facebook are constrained more and more the public space, the public square for trading ideas in person, we think that it could in the future there at least be a conversation about laws and control these companies' censorship practices or limit them when it gets to a point that these companies are exercising control over free speech.
Yeah, then you get into who wants the laws and who has the money. And like I said, in all the court cases that we've had, they've ruled in favor of these companies, that they have the right to control speech on their platforms. So I don't know if there's the appetite for, I don't know if there's this kind of, I don't know if Congress has got an appetite for doing anything. I don't know if the courts have got an appetite for upholding whatever laws they pass. That seems to be more of a legal question for me. And that's another thing in working on this stuff, just really not being surprised, but I guess a little bit just learning how much the legal philosophy is really, that's really what this is, making all these distinctions about speech and which kinds of speech. This is where philosophers love distinctions, but lawyers took it to town. Okay, go ahead.
Social media being
Right.
So I think that's just so interesting. You have like this idea, like, yes, it's a private company that I grew up on. Yes, like there's like these kind of dividing groups, like talking about, you say something like first people in the category, but other people don't hear it. And that kind of creates the problem that society's been trending. So many people cheer on individualism, like people are now talking on social media how to choose like groups like in person or like big thing that
Mhm.
made people realize that they can say it. That's what the bowling club. People used to have like bowling clubs where they would go bowling. You don't see that anymore. Like, it's a popular thing in there.
It was, yeah, I
Yeah.
remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's just so interesting how like it's more it's like individual and like believe that human beings are might be then that's like free speech also needs its own problem. Like how can we have a free speech platform where people have to be so
Mhm.
ultimately push self private things that they can't express themselves.
That was such a good comment. I don't even know how to like restate it. Yeah, I know. It's there's these deeper issues. I mean, and part of it, I mean, we've talked about this, Susie, a little bit with the algorithms, the way that it, it pushes you towards, it's not only that your speech is misfiring, it's that it's also, it's like you got one shot and it'll misfire and then you'll be put over here. And now all you see is people who agree with you. And that Facebook makes money when that happens, right? So they have no incentive to change any of that. They have no financial incentive to change that. So there's no, yeah. And it just seems like no matter how much you explain these issues, there's no way of, I don't know, there's no way of changing these algorithms, or, I mean, I'm sure there is, but there's no incentive to. Right. Right. Yeah. And you would hope that, yeah.
Well, I think we're in a place now in our society where we've lost the sort of values that were sort of, I hate to use the term gentleman's agreements, the sort of
Sure,
things
well.
where we sort of assumed a certain level of virtue in a president, or we assumed a certain level of, just quality of behavior in people who wanted to contribute to society.
Right.
And now there isn't even the base commitment to the truth. People just they're more happy in their bubbles than they are thinking that maybe their bubbles are misguided or misfiring. And so this is the thing that I'm concerned about as someone who cares about the humanities, because this is where your education is so important, that if without a commitment to the truth, we don't have a society. And granted, we're never going to know for sure what the truth is, and we don't want an absolute authoritarian truth coming down or anything like that. But the thing that we do have to have as a society that works is some sort of a commitment to the truth. And I just don't see that anymore.
And it might go back to incentives again.
Yes.
What incentive do I have to not put in that chat box, just this thing that's going on with Ukraine and the biolabs, right?
Yeah.
Why you put something in there that's not right? And then there's the, oh, you're committing treason by saying blah, blah. And it's like, is it what? And that's hyperbolic on both sides, right? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna comment. I don't have an answer, but I wonder how much of this kind of devaluing of truth is a result of social media, the algorithms funneling people into their own different categories, or a cause of it. I think it's probably both, but it seems like it can be equally a cause of not valuing truth, and then okay, we'll just all talk about the same thing, or it could be a result of these companies trying to make money people who think the same way, and then as a result, people just kind of naturally think, oh, well, I'll just say whatever I want.
Yeah. And maybe back to the say whatever I want thing. I mean, maybe just go back to the, Emil's original thing, which is, people should be able, he says you should have absolute liberty of thought, of freedom and opinion. And when you read that nowadays, you're like, really? I mean, it just sounds a little, I don't know. Okay, go ahead.
Right. Going back to Neil, yeah, so I wonder, because I don't know if it's true, but I think you're attributing a little bit like too substantial reading of Neil in this.
A two what?
Too substantial.
Oh,
Right?
okay.
Like you're saying like we want free speech because we want dignity. But the whole point, I guess, is that we don't know what dignity is and what moral progress is and what we don't know how these things will look like afterwards, right?
Right.
So it's like we want more than a substantial claim. It seems more like a procedural claim.
Okay.
It's like just open this and then let's see what happens, and then history, you have some very good reasons to think that
Yeah.
we will tend to progress and we will tend to kind of agreement on some truth or whatever.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's like, well, we don't see dignity around here, but like, well, yeah, that's the point. That's why you want freedom. That's why you want freedom of speech. You knew what dignity was. Just like say everything, just do this like this. But so in that sense, like it seems that from a million perspective, even true or dignity these platforms, then you can expect, or you have reason to expect that in the future of content there will be something like we can recognize as it was like moment of transition or something.
Okay.
Something like better, because if you like a substantial freedom of nearly all people need freedom.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, do you think this is a moment of transition? It's kind of a long one.
I think
But maybe historically speaking, 10 years, who cares? I don't know. We'll just be destroyed and then, start over.
I mean, the Twitter caused wars, like start for war.
I have thought about that too. Yeah.
Yeah, like the television, like the radio.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So like television, kind of
The precursor. Yeah.
yeah. So in that sense, it seems like another platform, right? Another transition in a way. And not even like favorite free lane. Like I don't see youngsters getting too much in Facebook. Like I just have an issue of 11 years.
They have Instagram. And Instagram is owned by Facebook.
I mean, I don't know. Youngsters like I don't know. You guys were like not all already. Like I'm a favorite generation,
Yeah.
People are in another stuff, right? Like kids are like things that we don't even like know. And so in that sense, it seems like there is some kind of not like learning process that is happening. So yeah, I see it more like a teacher period.
Well, maybe the more we talk about how these things aren't working for us, then that's the transition that we make, I mean, I use Facebook because that's the kind of paradigmatic thing, but yeah, no, for sure. My kids aren't on Facebook. They're on Instagram. Who knows what my grandkids will be on and whenever they're, but it's like, it's just gonna TikToks, again, I'm showing my ignorance, but my kids are also on TikTok. I know this. I see a lot of TikToks, right? So who knows what's next?
Sounds like a more sophisticated way to like process information. These things will just like come up.
Yeah, but we still have the same problem, which is that there's really no accountability. There's spreading of, you can say anything and there's no real accountability. And so things can get spread very quickly. I don't want to use the words disinformation, misinformation, but it's not, I mean, the old word is propaganda, that can get, and it's just, these things just spread super fast and there's no way of well, I mean, the pandemic's a good example. So, you know, there's a lot of times the information just isn't, it's not easy to figure out what the real situation is if you're on social media. You know, it kind of makes things a little bit opaque. Yeah. And then people get worked up and then you have these, they have real social consequences because people are loose with their speech. And there's no reason to keep them contained. Right. But then at the same time, I don't, I have no taste for censorship. So that's the quandary. Right. I mean, maybe, you know, maybe Joe Rogan's a good example. You know, we talked about that a little bit. You know,
I mean, there's been some backlash with, you guys know about the Joe Rogan situation on Spotify. And he is their number one money-making platform on Spotify.
Yeah.
And they don't want to get rid of them.
Um,
Doesn't seem to really have had too much of an impact.
I mean, what they ended up doing was putting warnings on every single one of his episodes where he talks about COVID. And basically the, you know, I listen to Joe Rogan. I know what he says, right? So basically whenever he talks about when he had COVID, he talks about how he took ivermectin and he got better. And so if he says that, then he gets a warning on that episode. So, and then the warning just says, for correct information on COVID, click here, which not everyone's going to do. Right. Okay, go ahead.
I think that just sort of going back to the you know, comment that we don't want or, you know, like an authoritarian force. That's sort of, it's a perfect time. So, no social media thing, make a statement on behalf of them. This is the correct, whereas what it should be, and at least to me, you know, any sort of platform like that, we embrace our free speech with it. Treat this kind of an, you know, education for people who are at university or at university. You know, everybody's on this shared journey, which I believe that education is. You're on this shared journey of trying to pursue the truth, you know, an objective truth, or some truths like you said, which we don't have a way of necessarily finding what the objective truth is. But, you know, I think that really kind of a necessary paradigm shift that we can use for the future. I think that social media kind of look at this and say, yeah, if you give our platform, and this is how we need to let people do it. In a way, to me, it's irresponsible that we are the authoritative. So here is the authoritative.
Okay, so there you go. Future right there, right? Yeah.
We are drowning in information, right?
Right,
I
yeah.
know this every time I have to research a paper, and you probably know this too, is that you feel like, oh, I haven't consulted this source. Oh, there's this source. No, my gosh, I have to read this source. Just published. And you feel kind of overwhelmed, like, can I say anything anymore? Because I haven't consulted everything, right? And so it's one of these situations where getting to the truth is such a thorny process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting to an argument is a thorny process. Trying to make sure you've covered all your bases, everybody is satisfied, and it's just really.
I mean, I don't want to pull the age card, but maybe are we thinking of it differently than these guys are thinking of it? Right, that the way we were trained is like exactly like you said, okay, I got to like research all this stuff and I've got to put forward my points and I've got to, right. And then, but you get on social media and people aren't doing that, but then they're getting tons of traction. And then you're thinking, are we in this post-truth world? Are we, like, was this not a good method? when it seems like nothing was wrong with that previous method, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know about you and your dissertation, but in my dissertation, I had a status questionis chapter that was like 60 pages long.
Yeah,
Where I had this, you know, the status questionis, when you state the state of the question. And you do a lot of research and you go through a lot of different things, a lot of different source material.
yeah,
And nowadays, I don't even know if I could write a chapter like that with all of the stuff out there.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
It's just so crazy. And so I think that the average person, maybe the average person without a college degree like you all are going to have, the average person just does not know how to go about, like, just got back from spring break Hawaii, right? So a lot of people, and Hawaii is probably the most responsible state I've seen in terms of masking, because they're a small island, they don't want to get, you know, bombarded. And I was in line with people talking very loudly about the mask mandates in Hawaii and how terrible they were and how restrictive, and, you know, we're from the free state of Florida, they said. And we're so proud in our state that we don't have to deal with any of this kind of stuff. And why do I have to do this and all this kind of thing? And so I, of course, stupid me turns around and says, well, I have immunocompromised students. And they are terrified to be in a classroom where people are not properly wearing a mask. Well, it's my body, my choice. They actually said this. Went on and on. You haven't done your research. It doesn't do anything. Blah, 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 blah. And my husband's like,
Yeah.
broken it. But the thing that bothers me is that the loud voices like them and people like me are trying to just tamper this down a bit. Let's think about responsibility. And I was thinking about this in terms of when you were saying about the harm. A mask isn't about protecting me, it's about protecting you from me, what I might have to give you. And so it's that sort of thing. Is this, where do we care about the harm that we're doing to each other? Do we care about the harm that we're doing to each other at all? And is that a value that only belongs in the religious sector? Is that a value that we can talk about? Like equality, like, you know, dignity? Is that a value that we can talk about, that we care about as a society? And we value it so much that we are willing to be wrong in our cherished opinions in order to protect someone else's dignity or health or equality or whatever. And so this is the thing that I'm just stunned by. Just this whole pandemic.
I think this is why I started working on this concept of good speech rather than free speech, because I do have this commitment to, what I should say is I have no appetite for censorship and wouldn't know how to construct an argument about that. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about good speech, which is, what is the speech that's going to help sociability and human flourishing, which are the things that which is what I'm, you know, kind of how I'm framing it as a kind of neo-Aristotelian. So what speech would that look like, right? But then at the same time, there's no, just knowing that, okay, what is it going to be? It's going to be some sort of imitation. It's going to be so you have to see it modeled, right? In order to do it yourself, like all kind of virtue theories. So, but if all I'm seeing is hyperbolic, abusive speech, how am I going to come up with speech that connects people? How am I going to come up with speech that encourages human flourishing? Do you see what I mean? That, and the way I've defined it is basically that you have speech that where your ends are integral to your means are integral to your ends. So basically, if my end goal is good, I don't then use an evil means to bring about that good end, right? And it seems like we use the speech in evil ways to try to bring about what we think are good ends, but then it's constantly misfiring. So now we're just like, but you can't legislate any of this. So now what do we do? Right. And so I think you talked about education, like there has to be some sort of educative process I mean, I hate to bring it back to these sorts of things where it doesn't sound like I'm talking about anything important, but like, there's just no way of teaching people. There's no way of forcing people to be good. And you have to, like you say, you don't want to use the term gentleman's agreement, but there is a sense in which we will not say things to each other to our faces, right? Which we might say to a stranger. I mean, I wouldn't, but a lot of people will say things to strangers that are horrific that you would never say to somebody in person. And it has something to do with like embodied interaction that is like really important for the human psyche. And social media gets rid of all of that. And we have to somehow we have to somehow connect our virtual world and our embodied world more than we're doing now, So, but I'm happy to hear that you think that social media can be educative, and that makes me very happy. And and yes, I know my kids are they're more positive about the future than I am, and I'm grateful for that, and that there's a way that, I think the important thing is to try to see a way forward, but at the same time, modeling those good, positive, healthy interactions in person, so that they're not completely destroyed by what happens online. Because I've had plenty of things destroyed in my life because of what's happened online, so how do you, and I think that's what drives me. What drives me is not wanting to treat other people the way I've been treated. Right. And you have to make that decision yourself. But I think.
And what is your incentive for wanting that?
Yeah. And it has to.
You want that because it's a good. Right?
That's right. You want it because it's a good. Right.
And not because, I'm benefited when someone, why should we care? I think this is the question that a humanities-based education is trying to give you, liberal arts education is trying to give you. Why should you care about something that you will never, actually personally benefit from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it's not, you're not getting an income from it. You're not, getting, accolades, awards. You're just doing something that is good in and of itself. And people, I'm just losing that. I used to have a lot more optimism about human beings in the sense that they do want that for people without their own personal.
Yeah.
I'm just not seeing it as much in society. I was so blown away by the vitriol in this couple.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I've seen it before, right? We've all seen this during the pandemic. We've all seen something like that. I have Asian students who've been attacked. I have, because they're Asian. And so it's these things where we've lost a sense of that good that we care.
Yeah.
I don't know what the incentive is.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I mean, yeah, again, going back to Brandon's point about this bowling, this bowling alone business, that you used to have spaces where you met people who weren't like you. And you had to learn how to navigate that and just kind of respect their humanity and know that you didn't agree with anything, but that was okay because you were going to have dinner together. Like there was no, right. But now it's like, I have friends who I know will not have dinner with me anymore that I used to have dinner with. It's like that, but it's because of a social media environment and where all they read is stuff that, so it does affect what happens online does affect the real world. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But we need the real world to stay together so that we can control what's happening online. So it's just kind of this circle, right? Go ahead. Give us another answer.
Well, this is as optimistic as you said, that social media can be educative. So I'm optimistic in that sense. But the one downside I think we've all seen in social media sort of going on with what you guys are saying is that it does, in a way, rob people of their humanity.
Right. Good.
The dignity of others.
Right.
That before social media, I suppose. As you said, people would go out,
Yeah.
together, and they navigate their differences and, just some other way.
Yes.
But now it's just, everything is just, social media is just full of that, hatred for other things. That's a big downside of social media, which in a way I think
Yeah.
more of an attachment from people's ability
Mm-hmm.
in that respect.
Yeah. I mean, maybe because of the pandemic. I don't know. What time is it? I don't even know what time was it.
It's 5:10.
Oh, okay. So a few more minutes. But I mean, I don't know if, I guess like a perfect storm of the pandemic and social media or whatever. But now it feels like, I mean, as you can tell, you probably don't, I'm not really on social media at all, but like, it just seems like when social media is now so much of a how I identify with people politically, and now what's our political action? What's our next political action? Like it's very connected that way, right? And so you're like, it kind of takes the humanity out of it when you politicize everything. And it's like, well, the reason we're getting together now on this is so that we can like go do this rally, or we can go to the school board meeting, or we can make sure we're doing this thing right, And sometimes you're like, I don't want to just see people as fellow political actors. I want to just be friends with them. Just kind of like trying to preserve this, what I refer to as transcendence, just kind of like something has to transcend politics in order for us to save it, right? We have to put politics in its place so that we don't let it destroy us. And to me, social media doesn't let you do that. It just immediately becomes politicized. It's like this very heavy politicized space. I speak as someone who like politics is my first love, it's like, I mean, I've been political since I was like 10, but I can't do this much of it or else it just takes the fun out of it, and then you're not, and then you don't feel like you're doing anything important. You just feel like you're doing something. I don't want to say the word mean, but you feel like you're being vindictive or something because the other side can't win, and there's no, anyway, I just think social media just exacerbates all of these problems while not really fixing some of them. And so, but again, I know the social media is here to stay. I'm not saying that it has to go away. It's just, we have to understand what it's doing and what and how to mitigate these things that we're losing, right? And somehow insert it back into like real life. Which is so glad which is why I'm so glad we're meeting in person again, because I feel like that's part of it.
Yeah.
If we can have these real relationships with physical people,
Yes.
It stems some of the, just some of the bad feeling, So anyway, but you want to talk about censorship. So.
The thing that concerns me about the censorship stuff is that now it's happening through the government. And I guess,
Yeah, well, and now
I guess that's another set of issues, but it's sort of like becoming trendy to censor this or that.
well, before you and I talked, there wasn't a war in the Ukraine.
Exactly.
And now it's done another turn.
Yeah.
Now we're at a whole other level that we have not seen,
Yeah.
Which is, like, I mean, I appreciate what you said in the introduction, about the, Russia stopped its last free
Yeah.
press and,
There's no more, yeah.
and it,
Well, I don't know, did you hear about the woman who interrupted a broadcast?
I did hear about that.
Immediately arrested.
Yeah.
We'll never know what happens to her.
Right. Yeah, we
Never
won't.
know if she survives that.
Right.
We'll look at Navalny and, how many people were arrested in Russia, like they estimate maybe 4,700 people have been arrested
Mm-hmm.
for protesting, and
Yeah.
there's a 15-year
Uh-huh.
sentence. And so I don't know where they're gonna jail all these people or send them all to Siberia. I don't know. I just think that when this starts to become something that like Tucker Carlson and his ilk admire, we're losing it. We're moving- this
Yeah,
is-
well,
this is-
well, like you say, how much are we taking a leaf out of their playbook?
Yeah.
How much is that happening? Right? Where you just sort of think, well, we value free speech. And especially in times of war, you need, I mean, come on, people, where are the anti-war demonstrators? I mean, like, with every single war we've been through, there's,
Well, when I
whether you agree with the
marched
war or not.
against the Iraq War,
I was just going to say
when I
that.
marched against the Iraq War, I got a lot, I'm not patriotic, I'm not supporting the troops, blah, blah, blah. And so you're not American if you're not supporting a war America's involved in.
Right. But now aren't we hearing that you're unpatriotic if you don't support Ukraine or something?
Oh, I
It-
haven't heard that. Has that-
I,
Is that something, is that a thing?
yeah, I think Whoopi Goldberg said it or something today or recently on that.
Well, geez.
But this is what I mean. It's like the accusations coupled with the censorship, coupled with the right. And so, but yeah, I mean, social media is this just seems to be out of our hands in terms of the censorship and the information. Oh, good, Celia, please help us out.
I guess so. I just have been thinking, my brain is like, I know, but I just noticed, like, since I've been silent this whole time, I feel like it is a result of everything going on social media, because even when we were on Zoom class, like, I was afraid to comment in class because I was worried it's recorded or someone can take a snippet of what I said and then do this, and I feel like it's actually asking to silence people.
Yeah.
They're afraid to just see themselves.
For sure.
Like in a real classroom, you can say something. This happens so many times in your classroom. Like, oh yeah, this is what I think. We'll be having a discussion, and then someone will say something. I'm like, oh, never mind what I just said. I disregard that.
Yeah.
It's stupid. And so I feel like when we're actually just talking with people, you can do that. But when it's social media, they take things and repost it,
Yeah.
silence you, and so then it gets to the point where you're afraid to just say that thing. And at the time,
Right.
You might think differently in the future. But
Yeah, there's no, yeah, I think it's there's free speech and then there's speech. And then there's like this, maybe this speech on social media isn't really free in a lot of ways because you're held to these impossible standards, which is that, like you say, I mean, in philosophy, goodness me, like I've been in a philosophy conference where one of the most important medieval philosophers stands up, talks for 20 minutes, and then he's like, actually, scratch that, forget everything I just said. He's like, actually, I was wrong.
That's great.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't do that on social media, That's right. You're like, oh, I cancel myself. Can I come back in? So yeah, no, that's a really good point. But again, it's back to these dynamics that like don't necessarily seem to.
and so it's like if the point of speech is to start with the truth and then connect with people, it's like
Mhm. Well, are we out of time? Or?
I think, yeah, that's
Okay.
a great place to end it.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Let's give another